A picture of literary chaos as might be produced if the characters of every book from Paradise Lost to Pickwick Papers broke from their covers and mingled in one mad romance. Such books, this manifesto concludes, have the same unity that we find in dreams. That is nothing more than an absolute unity of emotion. That is something GK Chesterton was exploring in an essay in 1901 called Dreams. And that actually foreshadowed what this book is, The Man Who Was Thursday. It is, like that says, the characters of every book from Paradise Lost to Pickwick Papers broke from their covers and mingled in one mad romance. Paradise Lost being like an epic, mythical, philosophical poem, and Pickwick Papers is Charles Dickens' first novel. It's a comedic book. And this is the mixture of those two, because G.K. Chesterton is known for his philosophical nonfiction writings, where he goes into from politics to theology. But he's also really comedic, and he's had a few novels. This is the most famous of them, and this has comedy and some actually espionage thrills, as well as that philosophical, political, theological, psychological stuff. So it's a really interesting mixture of genres. I have the Penguin Classics edition of The Man Who Was Thursday. So basically, to sum up this book, it is a psychological, philosophical, turn of the century espionage thriller. So at first glance, it's about a detective infiltrating a secretive order of anarchists in London in 1908. But as you read, it becomes a lot more than that. As G.K. Chesterton likes to write in paradoxes and cosmic level speculation on what's going on in the world, he gets into that throughout this book. The very beginning of the book begins with two poets in a park at sunset, and they're under these red clouds, this red, beautiful but violent sky. I'm not sure if he uses those exact words, but that's the way he talks about London in this book, in the setting it takes place in. It takes place in the context of the first decade of the 20th century in London. There actually were anarchists back then, and they actually were bombing people. This is leading up to World War I, and from what I've read, there was a lot of doom and gloom, a lot of apocalyptic talk in Europe at this time. So when I first read this, when I first heard about it, I thought, anarchists, like a secret order of anarchists, that sounds like some made-up thing. But it's not far from the reality that they were living in at the time. So there's two poets talking in a park. One of the poets is Gabriel Syme. He's the protagonist. And the other one is Lucian Gregory. It describes Gregory's red hair and the red sky. There's a lot of red in this book. It's interesting to look into the symbols of all the colors in this book. There's a lot of red going on in black. Syme gets into a kind of debate with Gregory, and they're talking poetry and art, and basically Gregory is an anarchist, but Syme, the main character, kind of pushes Gregory to the edge he pushes him into the corner to admit that he's not only a anarchist, but really a nihilist at his heart, and he doesn't believe in anything meaningful, and he believes that government is corrupt, the forces that be in the world, the powers that be are corrupt, and everything is meaningless because of that. And basically, Gregory is claiming that there really are anarchists, and they really mean business. They really do want to get rid of all order. That's a big theme in this book, is anarchy versus order. And of course, Syme, the protagonist, being a detective of Scotland Yard, he is on the side of order. But Gregory is on the side of the anarchists, and he's trying to prove to Syme that these anarchists are real and they actually are making plans and have power. And so he actually, to prove his point, he invites Syme to a council meeting of these anarchists. Because to Syme is saying that you're just talking the talk and you don't actually want the world to burn. This is just a fad. This is just BS. But Gregory says, no, we're for real. Come to this meeting tonight. So he brings Syme to this secret meeting across London. And then there's a part where, this is just like the first chapter of the book. I'm not spoiling anything yet. I'm going to spoil some stuff later. But Gregory brings Syme into this like secret parlor room, this inconspicuous like rundown like restaurant room, and then he like pulls a lever or something, and this table in the middle of the room starts to go down through the floor, and it turns into a spiral staircase down into a secret underground chamber. And that's when Syme discovers this secret, literally underground cabal of anarchists. And the people that are higher up in this anarchy secret organization, the higher up board is named after the days of the week. So there's Monday through Saturday, and then the leader of the group, who's this larger than life mythical being, is this guy's named Sunday. He's the leader of them. But they're not at the higher ups aren't at this meeting. They're just discussed about. But the election for the new Thursday is happening at this underground board meeting that Syme goes to. And he pulls some clever conversation maneuvers to win this little election underground to become the new Thursday. And Gregory, he wants to be the new Thursday, but Syme pulls a quick one on him and somehow convinces everyone in the room that he is even more of a diehard anarchist, even more committed to the cause than Gregory is. And that scene was really cool. And Gregory's just like, what? I'm the real deal. I'm an anarchist. This guy, I just met him in a park. He's just some guy I met in the park. He's just a poet or whatever. And the dynamics there are really interesting. And so the detective quickly rises up in the ranks in this anarchist order. And the next morning, he's headed to the higher up meeting of the full council of this secret organization, of the man who was Monday, the man who was Tuesday, the man who was Wednesday. Syme is the new Thursday. Then there's Friday and Saturday, and they're all going to meet the leader Sunday. So I'll leave it there for plot points. You should read the rest of the book. That's like the first third of the book at most. One scene I just want to talk about before I go into spoilers is this one part where there's a character telling a story about his life. And this is what he says. It's kind of similar to Syme infiltrating and becoming the new Thursday just by showing his commitment to the cause of the anarchists. It kind of parallels that story. But this other character is saying that I am by profession an actor, and my name is Wilkes. When I was on stage, I mixed with all sorts of bohemian and blackguard company. Sometimes I touched the edge of the turf, sometimes the riffraff of the arts, and occasionally the political refugee. In some den of exiled dreamers, I was introduced to the great German nihilist philosopher, Professor de Worms. I did not gather much about him beyond his appearance, which was very disgusting and which I studied carefully. And basically, this character, Wilkes, he's an actor, and he meets this philosopher, this Professor de Worms, and he says, when I met him, I was in a frivolous mood, and I disliked him so much that I resolved to imitate him. So this actor, just kind of for fun, starts imitating this professor who he like really dislikes. And then he soon meets the real professor. And then the philosophical artsy fartsy people in the room are like the Spider-Man moment of pointing like, wait, who's the real professor? Because there's Wilkes dressed up like the professor and then the real professor. And then they get into a debate to try to prove to everyone who's the real professor of this philosophy nihilism stuff. And the actor Wilkes, he says, whenever he said something that nobody but he could understand, referring to the real professor, I replied with something which I could not even understand myself. And it goes through this funny conversation, this debate they're having, kind of, where Wilkes is just making stuff up, but it sounds legit. He makes up this guy Pinkwurts, and he makes up Glump, and he talks about hedgehogs in Montaigne. He's like just pulling stuff out of his ass to make it look like he's the real philosopher. And then he actually proves to everyone in the room, he convinces everyone in the room that he's the real nihilist philosopher, and everyone else is like, get out of here, to the real philosopher. And it says he is now, I believe, received everywhere in Europe as a delightful imposter. And it kind of parallels the thing with Simon and Gregory, where just by playing these language games, he convinces everyone that he's the real deal, that he's really passionate about the cause. And just saying some sound bites is enough for him to gain status in this group. I thought that was really interesting and relevant to my video on BS that I just recently did, a book about BS. You should check that out. It goes deeper into that kind of thing. But I'm going to go into spoilers for The Man Who Was Thursday now. So if you haven't read it and you don't want spoilers, then click out and come back to this when you read the book. If you read the book, you know that the whole thing is a dream. Or it's not really a dream, it's a nightmare. And the subtitle of the book, it's not on this cover, but the subtitle of the book is A Nightmare. So it's cool how GK Chesterton just puts it under our nose from the very beginning. He tells us that it's a nightmare, and it ends up to be a nightmare. The introduction in this Penguin Classics edition is really interesting because this introduction is by Matthew Beaumont, and he goes into the background and the context historically of the book. And he talks about how this thing called a fugue state, this phenomenon of someone like zoning out and just being like walking in a walking dream state for like a day or two at a time. That idea of a fugue state came into the psychology world right around this 1900 when this book was written. The whole time, Syme was in like a fugue state, walking with Gregory, and they were just on a walk talking about life, basically. And this talks about how Syme is most himself when he finally becomes the man he pretended to be. He says, in becoming Thursday, he becomes himself. And Slavoj Žižek remarked of this book, it is no longer, if you want to show your true self, tear off the mask, but on the contrary, if you want to show your true self, put on the right mask. This is all really kind of trippy stuff that I'm still trying to understand. And that's the fun of this book, is that it has some thrills and twists and like espionage stuff going on, but it gets really philosophical and mysterious. And that's why I want to reread it. I think I want to take like a year or a few months before I reread it, because there's so much going on. This says, if in the introduction, Matthew Beaumont says, if Chesterton's protagonist, who himself experiences a form of ambulatory automatism, that's the fugue state, as he roams about the suburbs of London at night, can be seen as a mad traveler, then he too is finally made to remember that he has forgotten who he really is. The name Thursday is, in this respect, not simply the pseudonym that he must adopt when, as he falls into the depths of the nightmare, he is forced to assume the identity of an anarchist. It is his real name. It is the magic formula that, as in an incantation, brings his real identity into being. When Syme is forced to dress as Thursday for the final biblical masquerade at the end of the penultimate chapter, he experiences it as a relief, for though he affected to despise the mummy, he felt a curious freedom and naturalness in his movements as the blue and gold garment fell about him. So the man who is Thursday is framed in the form of an episode of mad traveling, a feverish tramp through the night in which Syme adopts the false identity that is in fact his true identity. The introduction later talks about, in orthodoxy, Chesterton talks about practical romance. It combines something that is strange with something that is secure, an idea of wonder and an idea of welcome. And that the need for this mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar, Christendom has rightly named romance. And that's what this book is. It paints the turn of the century London as like this really romantic, fascinating, mythical place, which apparently was new for that time. And GK Chesterton admired Charles Dickens for doing the same thing. And he wrote about Charles Dickens. I want to read his book about Charles Dickens more. I've only read excerpts of it. But just to touch on some other interesting spoilers in this book, it has a lot of symbolism with Genesis, with the leaders of the anarchist group being named after the 7 days of the week. And there's a couple little parts where it seems like there's some allegory going on with like darkness and light and nature, the different characters saying these things to each other. There's so much of like little witty jokes there being made about creation, because like Monday's talking to Tuesday, and there was darkness over the face of the deep, and then let there be light, and like these characters talk to each other, making little puns on that stuff. Also, this book has a lot of allegory with the book of Job. And G.K. Chesterton thought that Job was like the best book of the Bible, and he talks about it how he thinks that Job's friends are real. They seem to be encouraging him sometimes, but they actually are the real pessimists, because they are not seeking to get an explanation from God. They are trying to like judiciously appease God and just stay away from God punishing them. Whereas Job is seeking an answer because deep down he believes that God has justice and he has an explanation for what he's doing to Job, the injustice or the suffering he's putting on Job. And in this book, near the end, the members of the council are all objecting to the God figure, Sunday, and they are all kind of arguing with him. It's supposedly Chesterton is, kind of drawing parallels between those friends in Job and the members of the council. And there are common objections to people, basically saying, why do bad things happen? If God is good, why do bad things happen? Syme is like kind of Job in that, where he's continuing to ask questions and understand why God does what he does. Now, the thing is, this introduction in this book touches on the fact that the Sunday character in this book is not necessarily God. He might actually be like a allegory of the pagan conception of God, or a dark reflection of what the world thought God might be in GK Chesterton's time. And what's really interesting that I learned about this was that GK Chesterton wrote this book over 10 years before he converted to Catholicism. And he was coming out of this really dark time. And this book is called A Nightmare. And I think from what I've read, he was trying to paint a picture of the dark nightmare that he was finding himself in, like philosophically, in school, learning all this new psychological studies, the worldview of Europe totally shifting dramatically in the late 1800s. And so Chesterton is kind of giving an antidote to that view with this book by showing this nightmare that Syme wakes up from, and he has like this pessimism, this optimism, this renewed optimism at the end of the book, where he, like Chesterton talks about, he forgets that he forgets, or forgets that he forgot who he was. Because to Chesterton, this time period, everyone in that modern society was forgetting who they were. And I think that comes from a lot of the, like, Darwinism and science and psychology emerging and replacing a lot of ways that people were seeing the world. Instead of seeing things through the lens of Christ and the gospel, tradition, they were starting to see things as if, humans are like robots and like determinists. You have no free will. We're just acting out this psychological thing. GK Chesterton, was not cool with that, and that was dark to him. And so it's dark to me too, of course. And so this book is kind of like playing with those ideas. So this book, I think the first half is really cool and thrilling, and there's a bunch of twists, even if they're kind of repetitive twists. Is really interesting to read. And the second half is like a big puzzle, a big riddle. And that's what Chesterton talked about the book of Job, is that there's something beautiful in that God in the book of Job doesn't answer with direct answers to Job's questions. He actually answers in riddles. This is from Chesterton's autobiography, talking about his emerging from the pessimism of the turn of the century and forging a philosophy of optimism. He says, "When I had been for some time in these, the darker depths of the contemporary pessimism, I had a strong inward impulse to revolt, to dislodge this incubus, or throw off this nightmare. But as I was still thinking the thing out of myself, with little help from philosophy and no real help from religion, I invented a rudimentary and makeshift mystical theory of my own. It was substantially this, that even mere existence, reduced to its most primary limits, was extraordinary enough to be exciting. Anything was magnificent as compared with nothing. Even if the very daylight were a dream, it was a daydream. It was not a nightmare. The mere fact that one could wave one's arms and legs about, or those dubious external objects in the landscape which were called one's arms and legs, showed that it had not the mere paralysis of a nightmare. Or if it was a nightmare, it was an enjoyable nightmare." The introduction here says, "In the concluding paragraphs of The Man Who Was Thursday, Chesterton depicts a daylight in which, metaphorically speaking, Syme cautiously but triumphantly waves his arms and legs about, supremely grateful for the mere fact of existence. Syme could only feel an unnatural buoyancy in his body and a crystal simplicity in his mind that seemed to be superior to everything that he said or did." I love that, crystal simplicity. And I'll end with this. This is from Orthodoxy, and Chesterton gives an important preliminary account of what he calls this elementary wonder, the principal function of which is to recall us, as in an artistic or spiritual epiphany, to a profound, beatified sense of being. Chesterton writes in Orthodoxy, "We have all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. This man walks about the streets and can see and appreciate everything, only he cannot remember who he is. Well, every man is that man in the story. Every man has forgotten who he is. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. All that we call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only means that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful instant, we remember that we forget." Like and subscribe for more stuff like this. This is GK Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday. Hope you enjoyed it. I recommend reading this book. There's a lot more to it than what I went into, and I'll be reading more stuff like it and talking about it soon. So see you soon.